So what we are going to discuss today is how proactive organizations take a different approach to securing their SAP landscapes. And of course, present a brief on how we support organizations to actually achieve and build a roadmap in addressing these threats and risks proactively. Now, the problem that we see all the time is that, for instance, for a small example, is that when SAP notes are released, you have several high-scored vulnerabilities, for example, and then the question starts to run through our minds is it applicable to me? How can I able to detect a potential threat that is targeting this vulnerability while I work on a proper strategy, for instance, to roll out this patch? Or can I determine a risk factor for this vulnerability across my environment? And what is the impact on this environment, or what is the impact of this vulnerability on my business? So there are different questions, you know, who is responsible for this around the cloud when we are doing a transformation? What is my attack vector? There's different questions that we usually hear. But one important question is, where should I start? Or where should someone start when they are trying to figure out what to prioritize, what to address first, and so on. So hopefully by the end of this session, you'll be able to get an idea of where to start, in either, I don't know, prioritizing your security strategy or addressing threats and risks based on a risk-based approach, or maybe even smartly allocating budget to implement those security mechanisms. So we'll be looking at this SAP threat landscape to determine if it is different than an actual threat landscape for our entire enterprise or not. We'll look at proactive, reactive methods and see how we can implement or maybe enhance this to use both of them. And while doing that, we will look how the evolution of the proactive approach becomes interesting when we do combine different concepts that we are going to introduce. And of course, one concept that we will be looking at is definitely threat modeling. Now, I will not be going in depth about threat modeling. We already have an e-learning course about threat modeling, and there is a surprise for whoever signs up with us. We usually do not bombarde people with emails. We have updates about these events, our blogs. Maybe we create a blog in regards to this approach. We send it out to everyone who is interested. So if you're interested, scan the QR code and sign up with us to receive all this updated information. And as I said, there is a surprise around during the session for anybody who signs up. All right. So SAP threat landscape. The question is the actual SAP threat landscape really different than the rest of our environment? Now, I would say no, but what you have is actually unique threats that are specific to the SAP environment. So that your cybersecurity or information security teams might not be aware of, for different reasons, expertise, familiarity with the SAP environments, and so on. But also, usually your common intrusion detection systems or prevention systems, maybe vulnerability management systems, monitoring devices are incompatible with SAP proprietary protocols, your application servers, your logs that are generated from an application server. So before I actually continue, I would like to agree on a very broad definition of what a threat landscape is. So to do that, it refers to all existent cyber threats that could impact and cause harm to your organization. Now let's have a look at some of these threats using some statistics from different organizations and institutions that have been released, and see if we can derive what effect it has on the organization. So these are a small amount of data, but you can get more. So so there are more than actually 1 billion malicious programs and of course variants that are known. On a single day, as you can see, 560,000 are actually new malwares are detected based on the AV Test Institute. You have ransomware that is spiking across the world. The cost of ransomware, where people are paying or organizations are paying. Data breaches. We saw last year a couple of massive data breaches that are happening. So there are more numbers and statistics to see. There's quite a lot. So while looking at these numbers and pondering, you would be pondering or questioning yourself, what does this have to do with my actual threat landscape? It's quite straightforward. From these numbers, we start asking ourselves, how does this affect or deal, how is my organization dealing with the different threats that might affect what I do? Or are we waiting for these malwares or for these data breaches to happen before I investigate or I respond? Am I waiting for a breach, a ransomware, or a malicious actor that has been in our network for the last couple of years without the ability to detect it? What are we exactly doing? Also, there are more, as I said, data for each industry. So you can see that your threat landscape is actually huge when it comes to that. And if you're thinking right now to yourself that this can be reduced and improved to your organization, then you're absolutely right. Which brings me to my next point. Proactive and reactive. So starting from this here, we want to determine, of course, what proactivity means, what it looks like, and try to see what reactive approach means. What does it have to do with my organizations, and what do organizations do to excel in actually both of them? Now, starting from this point on, I'm going to show you how we're going to slowly evolve our proactive approach to something that helps you first start somewhere, definitely, and second, enables you to build on what you take from this session and adapt into your organization. So at the end of this, we want to try to answer the question, where am I going to start? So the reactive approach. Very simply, very easily, we are trying to manage a crisis. We are trying to respond to or investigate incidents if we actually can detect them. We want to restore operations from the backups that we have, hoping that the backups have been tested and we can restore from them. Some organizations react by paying a ransom because they don't have a certain mitigation or certain criteria in place to not do that. We want to evaluate known vulnerabilities, so CVEs that are highs or CVS scores that are high. We would like to evaluate them and then see what they have effect on our environment. These are all reactive approaches. We react to an event. So in layman terms, you start responding and reacting to threats, of course, based on a different incident, event, or a breach. For instance, like this example, after the Uber breach last year, I think it was around December, we saw over, and this is a short list of the hiring that went on. We saw a very short list. We saw a lot of hiring started for our for the security positions in Uber. Now, keep in mind that those areas are still important, but they cannot be the only thing that we have to do or we need to do in organizations. So how can we introduce this to our proactive approach? Our proactive approach. And yes, this is our first version, so we will improve it as we go. For an organization to be proactive, it implies that it has the ability to, of course, anticipate future needs or problems or any changes that happen in our environment and take action appropriately. So it's quite easy to list down a whole bunch of stuff that our organization needs to do to become ahead of the game. And of course, start approaching threats proactively. Now, this list is quite extensive. These are some of the examples you see. Continuous security assessments. Is it after a change? Is it during a new deployment, a new implementation, transformation, you name it? We need to have continuous security assessment. When we are testing our resilience or testing our incident response and activities, we are maybe testing our business continuity plan or our disaster recovery plan. when we are maturing in the way we are detecting or monitoring. So are we doing, I don't know, red team activities, purple team activities? Are we conducting attack simulations that help us, improve our detection capabilities? Is our security strategy unique and niche to the areas, or does it address unique and niche areas like SAP? Or are we in a mature place where our security or our organization has a good culture program or security awareness program that is designed and adaptive for each business process? And are we applying regular patches immediately, which is a very big question on why, applying patches immediately. Now, listing all these, different activities is all great, of course, but let's be realistic that most organizations can't afford to do all this, or maybe do not have the resources to do this. And to even reach a maturity like this, one important aspect is determining where you actually are. And I'm not saying that you have an idea of your gaps, and you can name them for me, or you can provide them from a 200-page or 300-page report extracted from a vulnerability assessment tool with known vulnerabilities. But what we need to do is actually visualize them. Why? Let me explain it with a small example. It's actually a reactive example, but and then we continue on improving this with the proactive approach. And finally, I'll present to you how actual proactive organizations we work with are paving the way to actually achieve a list like what we have seen. So everybody probably is aware of such an email. I haven't put the entire email. You receive it from SAP with your security notes. You go into your security notes, and then you start determining a list. So this was taken from a blog from Onapsis. They write excellent blogs. And then you start going over the list. Now, please bear in mind, this is not a complete list. You see here, you have a CVSS score of 9.9. You determine that you don't have any business of a BO or BI platform in there, so you cross it off. Then you see another CVSS 9.9. And you determine, do I have, is it applicable to me? No, it's not applicable. Fine, and then so on and so forth. Then you reach a CVSS 9.0, which is the capture replay vulnerability. We determine that it is applicable for, we want to check if this is applicable to us. So what we do is quite straightforward. We look at the vulnerability, we understand it. So for whoever, if you are not aware of it, so this affects actually systems that are using trusting or trusted destinations are affected by this. It is quite easy to see those applications or the application servers that are affected by this. And then you determine its applicability, and then you want to remediate. All right, let's do this. That's quite easy. And then you list out a plan. All right, so the first thing that we do is update kernel, and we update ABAP in all systems. We migrate those destinations that are used, that use the trusting relationships, of course, by implementing a report or by executing a report. And then we start migrating these trusted or trusting relationships one by one. Now, every time you do that, it will create, I believe, a individual key and puts them in a secure storage. So no more database. Quite critical here, but let's move on. We're still reading what we are going to do, And then for us to block any connections that were not updated or application servers that are not updated, we set a profile parameter. Excellent. So now we want to actually start to do it. And first thing we know about is updating kernel. First thing we have to do is to restart the minute that we do an update. Well, that doesn't work in most companies because it will stop operations, it will cost a lot, and so on and so forth. The list is quite huge. So in that instance, what would you do if you can't apply this patch immediately? Do you actually ignore it? Do you, I don't know, raise it to management and then ignore it, which is sometimes common? Do you accept it? Or do you implement, I don't know, a use case around it for detection? But I will get back to this shortly and see how we can improve on this. So the proactive approach, which brings us back to the proactive approach, but this time version 2, where we want to introduce threat modeling. Now, from our example, we start asking ourselves, how can we as a team or organization detect potential attackers or threats, internal or external, trying to exploit this vulnerability that we have seen. And this is all just for the time being, until we have actually planned and executed a rollout schedule to all affected systems. So when are we able to actually do this restart and patch all of these systems? Now, I will not dig into what threat modeling is or how to start with it. We have actually created an introductory course in our academy that helps us to do that. As I promised, we have in the beginning, whoever signed up in the beginning of the session will join a raffle to win a free seat in our e-learning course. So whoever signed up, our head of academy and myself will contact you for that raffle. So back to our story now. Threat modeling, just as a benefits on what it improves, you have a lot of benefits in threat modeling. So what we want to try to do here is bring together teams that will support in different areas in understanding and, of course, prioritizing security requirements. Now, once that is done, we start looking at risks in our, development or third-party development process, in our infrastructure, in our data flows. We prioritize and implement mitigation and remediation across identified security gaps. Still, we are doing a lot of reactive stuff. We now understand gaps in our monitoring capabilities and detection mechanisms. We are effective in our communication between different areas, different teams, your cybersecurity team, your information security team, your audit team, that helps you address where risks, threats, and opportunities can exist across your environment. With these concepts in threat modeling, let's go back a little to our example and identify what we are able to do. So here we have a small, I would say, infrastructure or a small architectural visualization of the ASME network, a very common network that some of you guys would probably came across. We see that we have a couple of application servers. We see that we have a database. The boundaries are set based on what we have there, based on the teams that were together. We see how everything is being connected. We see some external apps connecting through different interfaces and so on. So we determine, and then we determine that the applicability of the vulnerability to the systems that are marked in red, we see that the affected servers can actually be turned off. So this is our scenario again, and it will disrupt operations. So I started with this section asking questions of what's the best, all right. And the next thing we come up with is try to determine, I probably wanted to ask a question, yes. So I started to ask in the beginning of this section, what's the best next thing to do if we can't patch immediately? Of course, while we are planning and communicating and whatever you need to do to convince operation that you need to shut down or restart those servers. The next thing you come up is try to determine how you can detect someone trying to abuse this vulnerability from my point of view. So you update your diagram a little to show what you're capable of detecting. So here we see that, okay, so I see that one of the application servers is feeding logs to a SIM. Of course, you need different stuff, but we're not going to get into a technical areas. But anyway, a firewall is feeding into a SIM, the SAP router, a web application firewall, and so on. We determined that there is a gap. We determined that there is a gap where with the right teams involved, you can fix this gap, configure the appropriate use case. You see that gap is in the X mark. And then with fix this gap, configure the appropriate use cases that enables you to detect if this attack happens. From this model, we were able to determine our gap. If someone will target us with this vulnerability, we are able to adjust and, of course, apply apply changes that are required. Excellent. Now, this is all still reactive. You know, we are reacting to a known vulnerability before it gets weaponized, or maybe it is already weaponized, so it will not be able, or we will be able to detect it once it is used against our network. Excellent. Now, let's improve our approach. So let's further add new concepts to what we have learned. So what we want to do is now we want to determine, based on the different components or the environment we have, is the threat landscape, not the entire 560,000 malware that are on a daily basis detected, or a billion different variants. No, we want to understand what is the threat landscape for our organization. We want to determine if attack vectors and critical paths based on what components that we have. Threats that can actually affect the entire operation. We analyze them. Do we verify them running attack simulations? Are they applicable to us, or do we have a defense mechanism that can actually stop them before creating mayhem? Are we doing tabletop exercises, threat hunting that is conducted on a timely basis to try to figure out what threats are applicable to the environment I have? And finally, will I be able to automate those benign or those small events or alerts that I'm getting to actually respond to bigger events that might take more time? So this approach now as V2, coupled with the reactive approach, we saw in the first version of the proactive approach and the reactive approach, we are ready to finally create our final version. Now, please keep in mind that this is an ongoing example and I will always enhance it. So the final version will look something like this, the ProReactive approach. I know probably this is a made-up word, so which is great. I think I like it. I'm probably going to be using it a lot. So it is the ProReactive approach. What it does, first of all, what it looks like is that we have different teams working together. And this is one important critical aspect that we see. During different interactions with our customers, the first thing that we point out is that the SAP team is completely sitting in a different closet than the IT team and the cybersecurity team, or the SAP basis team is trying to conduct an entire security assessment without any knowledge of what is happening around the SAP infrastructure. Now, which is great, it's not bad, it's just, it doesn't work. We saw that when teams are working together, this is where it becomes more of the ProReactive approach. Now, in prioritizing vulnerabilities, here we stop reacting based on a CVSS score. You know, a 9.9 doesn't mean a 9.9 for a 9.9 for ASIMI network does not mean a 9.9 for no monkey, and so on and so forth. So this can reduce our risk. Now, responding to incidents in a sense where our mean time to detect has been reduced, our mean time to respond has been reduced. Automation is taking care of incidents and events, small incidents and events. You know, with a proper response workflow, everything is working perfectly. And we are improving our measures based on the intelligence that we are getting. Yes, we have threat hunting, we are leveraging IOCs, we are leveraging intel that is coming from outside. So our entire threat landscape is being based on the intelligence that we have for the entire landscape, for the entire architecture. And then the strategy is being addressed, is being continually improved, that is addressing, you know, your niche areas like SAP. What do you do with proprietary, or what do you do with the network? What do you do with data flows that are going? And then finally, your spending becomes smarter. You know what you need to do, with what budget, and most importantly, why you need to do that. So when it comes to management, it is easy to say, okay, this is where I'm stuck, or this is where I have a gap. This is what I need to do. This is the budget for it, or this is how much it costs, and so on and so forth. So you will be able to prioritize your spending. Back to our example. So here, we are able to determine that what threats might potentially, impact the environment, and whether they're actually applicable to the defense mechanisms I have, and whether I need to do anything or not about it. So based on our architecture, because we have maintained and we have tested and we have done all these points in our ProReactive approach, our model would look something like this. Here we are determining that it is impossible to exploit, or not impossible, but the exploit is might be hard because of the measures that are in place. We added a service between the external application. We extended our boundaries between internal users and the SAP application server. So we still understand that the vulnerability is high based on the CVSS score. That does not change the fact. But to exploit it, and the impact it has, actually reduces to low, because it would be very hard with all these stuff in place to reach the SAP application service and try to exploit that. So this is how it starts to be applicable to your organization. And this is how you start to prioritize what you need to do when you have a list of things, an SAP note, or a monthly SAP note, SAP patching monthly basis, or Windows for that fact. But there's something you need to understand, is that you still need to patch. So, but you don't need to panic when you have a CVSS score of 9 or 9.9 and so on. Now, where do I start? And this is where I come and try to answer, where do I start? Try to bring your teams together. And I do actually try to always say that we need to bring the security team, whether cybersecurity or information security, and bring the audit team, bring the architecture team, whoever is responsible for authentication, and put them together to create that threat model. It's quite simple. It's quite tedious to create it at the beginning, but it really helps when you have that. When you want to prioritize your activities based on that, then it is easy for you to spend the budget, or to spend on smartly. Then you are able to zoom in on critical business processes. Yes, here it is where you start taking that threat model and zooming in further to creating more data flows, more modeling around business processes. You want to modify these strategies based on those areas. So you modify your security strategy based on, I don't know, a use case, for instance, fraud, which is very common around SAP. And then what you have to do is maintain that model. You automate the stuff that you don't need a level 1 SOC guy or a level 1 SAP basis team to do that, and repeat that process. It becomes easy for the ProReactive approach and that huge list to become actually achievable. So, in conclusion, the ProReactive organizations, when they align those different defenses, security measures, processes, and of course, these strategies to reduce cybersecurity risk within their organization, they anticipate their needs, and of course, they adopt a proactive behavior to securing their business critical processes and data, but also are well aligned to respond when something happens, invoking, of course, the reactive approach. Now, threat modeling, there are a couple of tools out there that are amazing to use. I came across a startup as well recently that does threat modeling for SAP, which is amazing. But start here, finally. That's it for me. But before you leave, if you love to meet us, and I know you're dying to meet us, we will be in DSAG, well, I cannot say it in German right now, but Technology Day and JISIC next month. So if you guys want to meet us, discuss stuff, tell me about my presentation, that it sucked, it didn't suck, please scan those QR codes. There are 2 different QR codes and book an appointment with us.